Because you're anxious to get to the reception after this, I'm just going to say that we're now ahead of schedule. And I'm going to make the executive decision that we're probably going to skip our movement break and we're just going to power through until the end because that'll get you completed a little earlier today and back upstairs to have some conversation. So with that, our next presenter this afternoon is Tom Sarkus, and he is the Division Director at the U.S. Department of Energy, and he's going to address the topic of major Department of Energy fossil demonstration projects involving carbon capture and geologic storage.
Good afternoon. There's an old saw in government that the longer your title is, the less important you are. In the name of my division, I don't usually put it on bios like this because we want them to go quick, is Project Financing and Technology Deployment Division in the Office of Major Demos within the Strategic Center for Coal. Too much to fit on one slide. I come from NETL, and I trust that you're familiar with NETL. It's a sizable organization. It's one of the national labs, but it's kind of small as national labs go. We have, I don't know, maybe 1,400 people that work there. About 700 of them are government DOE employees like myself, and another 700 work for us as site support contractors for a veritable alphabet soup of organizations. So a lot of times I come into audiences and they say, do you know so-and-so? And they can't really figure out what I do. I started out working in research in the laboratories at NETL, benchtop things. And then I moved into project management with extramural projects that we fund with industry, universities, other national labs, and so forth. And got my first taste of things at pilot plant scale, which is kind of bigger. And then I moved into the major demos. So we have, I don't know, probably 400 research and development and demonstration projects that are managed at NETL, and I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of all 400 of them. The reason I get invited to venues like this is I work with the 8 largest with the demonstration scale, and that's what I'll talk about today. But I'd like to show this slide because research, development, and demonstration, we think of it a lot of times as a pipeline. But from the time a university professor gets an idea to the time you can put it on a utility scale plant and operate it consistently and reliably, that can very often take 15, 20, 30 years because it's a big scale, and a lot of people don't think about that. If you want to build a 300 megawatt wind farm, you take 3 megawatt wind turbines and you replicate them. You build 100 of them. You don't scale it up 100 times. But for coal plants, you have to scale it up. And a lot of times it's hard to explain this concept to non-technical people or even technical people who really haven't worked a lot with the power industry. Right. This is sort of saying that it's something similar, and I trust many of you are familiar with EPRI and the TRLs, technology readiness levels. Again, to get from a TRL1 to a TRL9, you could be looking easily at a 30-year time frame. But some of our technologies don't have to start all the way at a TRL1. Usually for most of the technologies that I'll be talking about today, are already at a TRL at least a 6, and then really most of them are at a 7. So we're talking about moving these technologies from TRL 7 to TRL 8 or 9. That doesn't take 30 years. I mean, maybe it takes 5 years. Maybe, I guess if it's difficult, it could take 10 years. Who knows? Another thing always comes up. I'm always there are all these skeptics of CCS, and I'm not the carbon capture and storage archangel. I did not create the program, but I do what my bosses tell me to do. So I didn't create this policy, but I work within it and try to make it as practical as it can be. Bruce Kaiser, a brilliant analogy with the aviation industry. And sometimes I lapse into it, like with the car industry. You know, we all drive around cars, and they're kind of descendants of the Model T and its progeny, but they're very different from the Model T too. And the same thing is going to happen with CCS if it becomes an industry. It's not going to, it's not going to stay in an obsolete form. So the way a lot of thought has gone into this, and it's hard for me to summarize in a 20 or 30-minute presentation, but DOE envisions this coming out in 3 waves. You know, we have the demos that I'll talk about very quickly today, and I have backup slides, and you can find more things online, and I'll be happy to talk to you if you want to learn more about any of those. And that's what we call first-generation technologies. Then we're thinking another demo round. We don't know exactly when, but we're trying to test the waters for getting some funds. You know, if you watch the DOE budget cycle, we're in fiscal year 2014. The fiscal 2015 budget is all but set. So, you know, we're talking about things we might be able to start funding beginning in fiscal 2016. But it takes us a couple years to get enough funding to do these big demos. So we're probably looking at getting funds in 16, 17, 18, maybe even 19, and then running a demo round, and you know, this bunch would, you know, we could maybe demonstrate around the 2020 time frame. Then there are some really interesting, intriguing technologies at the earlier TRLs, okay? These are the bench scale and small pilot scale technologies, things that we refer to as transformational technologies. It's going to take longer to get them up to TRL 6 and 7 to where we can demo them, and so we're looking at demos for those technologies in the 2030 time frame. So we're always asked, you know, is CCS commercial? Is it ready for demonstration? Yeah, it's ready for demonstration. We've got several demonstrations under construction. One's in operation, but it's like automobiles and aviation. It isn't exactly where we want it to be, and the main parameter that isn't where we want it to be is the cost. So we have this program designed that over time to bring the cost down. All right. Long history of major demos. I've been working in the program since the mid-1980s. I've had the privilege of working with scrubber, low NOx burner, SCR, SNCR demos, duct sorbent injection back in the 1980s and 90s. I've participated in funding 4 different IGCC plants, which is about half of the IGCCs that have been built in the United States. A large CFB at JEA in Jacksonville, so quite proud of those accomplishments. And, you know, in those cases, SO2 control costs money, and I hate to admit it, but I'm old enough to remember back when people were arguing about whether we should install scrubbers on the power plants. And there were 2 camps, and one camp said, no, this is terrible, it's going to bankrupt the country. They took out a full-page ad in the Washington Post, and in there was a picture of the Washington Monument, the tip, sticking out among a sea of scrubber sludge. You know, they were saying that you're going to bury the country in scrubber sludge. Well, we're seeing sort of the same division happening with carbon capture. SO2 control, NOx control, mercury control, CO2 capture. I don't know any one of those processes that doesn't cost money. And the same thing happens here. Probably talking in order of magnitude more, but okay. So I know these things intuitively because I've worked on the demos and I've observed them and I've participated in them. But Ed Rubin at Carnegie Mellon has studied this more mathematically and more like an engineer. And these are the learning curves that were experienced for SO2 and for NOx. And as you can see, the compliance costs came down. We haven't gotten them to where they don't cost anything or to where they're profitable and make money for the power plant that they're installed on. But we have brought the compliance costs down dramatically. And if you go in and look at Ed's paper, I have one referenced here, but he has many. He's gone in and looked at carbon capture and believes that we can apply a very similar learning curve process by learning by doing with these demos to bring down the cost of CCS. I mean, why couldn't we? We did it with, as Bruce said, airplanes. We did it with automobiles. We did it with SO2 capture. We did it with NOx capture. We've done it with particulate capture. So why in the world can't we do it with CCS? All right, here are our 8 demos. I'm going to go through them very quickly. Jordan covered 2 of them, so I'll go through those 2 hopefully super quickly. 6 of them use enhanced oil recovery. 2 of them are saline. The 2 saline projects, as Jordan mentioned, are FutureGen and ADM. Those are the 2 in Illinois. And partly because of the Mount Simon and the kind of unique, impressive geology that formation has. The cost of this, they stagger most of the audiences I talk to. We're looking at about $17.8 billion, with $3 billion of that coming from the Department of Energy. Now, I kind of get in trouble when I talk in front of my management at DOE. My experience tells me on major demonstrations that most of them do not get built. A lot of them just don't happen. You don't, I made a comment, if Bill Gates, and when he started Microsoft, if he had to go get a $5 billion loan in order to start the company, we probably wouldn't have Microsoft. And that's the main reason a lot of these projects don't go forward. They can't get the financing. So it's not always technical. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's environmental. Sometimes it's a change of management. But financing is the big thing, and that's the big reason why some of these projects won't go forward. But I'm also smart enough to know that I can't predict which ones won't go forward. It's kind of like handicapping horse races. If I were to handicap it today and I were to come back next year, my slate would be different. Things, they change, and that's the nature of these projects. Here we have the chart showing a little more detail on some of the technologies of the 8 projects. 5 of them are power projects, 3 are industrial. I'm going to try something a little bit different today. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on the industrial projects. Usually for an electric power audience, they go to sleep, and I think that's exactly the wrong thing to do, because you have valuable lessons to possibly learn with CCS if you want to implement it from these industrial projects, and I'll touch upon that in a moment. Kemper County. Kemper's, it's in the news, and I was on the selection panel for this project, so I've known it from the beginning. It was not a CCS project as it was originally proposed to the Department of Energy. It's a 65-to-1 scale-up of the transport gasification technology that's been piloted at Wilsonville. And it was originally proposed as a trig scale-up in Orlando Utilities. Well, the governor of Florida came in and said that he didn't want any more coal plants in Florida, so it moved to Mississippi, and as a part of that, Southern Company offered to do carbon capture, but this was not originally a CCS project, so I sort of bristle when people say, oh, CCS is so expensive because of Kemper. Well, it was kind of an afterthought for Kemper. But anyways, this is the largest project that I've had the privilege of funding. The department is contributing $270 million. There's a DOE scope, but that doesn't include the whole project. There's a new lignite mine being sunk. There's a connector pipeline being built to transport the CO2. And when you look at the all-in costs, as Southern Company is reporting them, it's coming in at $4.5 to $5.5 billion. We're looking at a startup in next year. They're already doing things like heating the gasifier. This is a massive project, and I hope at some point you get to hear someone from Southern Company explain it in more detail and more correct detail. But our construction, on-site construction people peaked at 6,100. They're down to about 5,100 from what I hear. And I'm hoping to get a chance to visit this again before they start demobilizing the site later this summer. The trig gasifier, if you don't know, is very amenable to low-rank coals. You know, when we look at the IGCC plants, one of the criticisms, especially from places like the West, where they have low-rank coals, is, well, Tampa and Wabash don't operate on low-rank coal. Never mind that the forerunner of Wabash at Plaquemine, Louisiana, did operate on low-rank coal. So the trig was developed specifically to gasify low-rank coal, and in this case it will be Mississippi lignite. Fairly simple design that kind of comes from a different industry, fluid catalytic crackers that are used in oil refining. So similar piece of equipment, but a different application. This is actually a sort of an older construction shot showing the gasification area, gas cleanup, the combined cycle power plant area, reservoir. This is the new lignite mine that's been sunk there. Just a big activity. We have two Polygen projects, again, that kind of are hoping to leapfrog off of IGCC technology. Those are the Summit, Texas, and HECA, Hydrogen Energy California project. Both of them have completed FEED, and both of them are trying to achieve financial closure. Remember, I said that's sort of the biggest hurdle with these kinds of projects, and in the case of Summit, we're looking at close to $4 billion, a little bit less right now. In terms of poly generation, this plant would make electricity, put some of it onto the grid. They have an offtake agreement with the municipal in San Antonio. And they would also produce urea, which is a chemical used for fertilizer. It's a chemical that the United States once exported an awful lot of, but that quit in the early 2000s when we had high gas prices. It all went offshore, or most of it went offshore. So they would produce electricity, urea. They would sell some of their CO2 into EOR applications. And they would be able to follow different markets. This is an idea, this polygeneration, that has had attraction to researchers and academics for years. And these are the first two commercial type projects that I've seen make a run at it. This is sited at one of the FutureGen's candidate sites near Odessa, Texas. Here's a schematic. This would use a Siemens gasifier and also a Siemens combined cycle. HECA, in contrast, would use a Mitsubishi gasifier and also a Mitsubishi combined cycle. Another difference, HECA would also produce electricity, urea, and sell the CO2 into EOR. In this case, it would be the first EOR CO2 flood in the state of California, which is a large oil-producing state. There are a couple of differences. Summit would run all out, whereas HECA will do more load following. This is looking to be a $5 billion project. And here you have a kind of an artist's rendering of what the plant will look like. It's sited near Bakersfield, California. Another project that you'll probably find of interest, even though it's an IPP, and I don't know that we have that many people from independent power producers here today, is the Petronova or NRG project. It's at the Parish station outside of Houston, Texas, which I believe is the fourth largest power plant in the United States. And they're going to put a 240 megawatt slipstream on one of their coal-fired units. They're going to use the Mitsubishi amine to capture the CO2 post-combustion. We had 3 post-combustion capture projects in our program. 2 of them fell out So this is the only one that currently remains. What NRG has done, a couple of novel, what I think are novel things when I first saw their proposal. One of them is that to regenerate this amine, to capture the CO2, you need steam. And to extract the steam from your power plant is going to derate it. Well, they've installed a gas turbine to generate all of the steam for the process, and also some additional electricity that they can put onto the grid. So you don't always have to go in and monkey around with a steam cycle that you've been optimizing for the past 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And I thought that was kind of at least a semi-elegant way around that problem. The other thing that they're doing is everybody talks about what's the cost of CO2. And the NRG people don't get up I've only seen them talk to a conference once. So they don't get up and really tell everybody this. But from the time that I did hear them explain this in public, they figured that there was a way they had to get around the price of CO2. And the way they're getting around the price of CO2 is that they've partnered with an oil company called Hilcorp. Hilcorp is kind of a middle type company. They're well known. They make the lists of one of the best companies to work for in the country if you follow those kinds of things. And they have some mature oil fields that are candidates for EOR. You can't use CO2 flooding on just any oil field. It's usually the mature oil fields that have exhausted primary production and also secondary production, secondary being water or steam flooding. After you exhaust those two techniques, then you go into tertiary production, which is CO2 flooding. So they found an oil company with a lot of mature oil fields that are a candidate for this, and an oil company that's willing to partner with them and accept lower returns than it makes making oil by itself, and an oil company that's going to operate the oil field so they don't have to, so NRG doesn't have to run a business all by itself that it doesn't know and isn't used to doing. They're sort of sticking to their knitting. Well, why would an oil company partner with a power company in order to make less money than it's used to making? Because the power company brings money that can fund the infrastructure to put in these old oil fields. So, so here's the economics, just like really quickly. You spend $80 to $100 to put on one of these, $80 to $100 to capture a ton of CO2 from your power plant. You then turn around and sell it to an oil company for $20, $30, maybe if you're lucky, $40 a ton. Okay, so you spent $80 to $100, you sell it for $20 to $40. You just lost a lot of money. The oil company then goes, and based on the experience in West Texas over the past 40 years, do you know how much oil they can recover per ton of CO2? Anybody know? You don't count, Jordan. You do know. 3.1 barrels of oil. Okay, so what does the oil company, how much money does the oil company make from 3.1 barrels of oil? What's the cost of a barrel of oil today? And more importantly, the way the question my managers posed to me is, Tom, what do you think the price of oil is going to be for the next 50 years? And I don't know, $80, $90, $100. For sake of argument, sometimes I'll crunch the numbers at $10. And we all know oil isn't going to cost $10 for the next 50 years. But so the oil company pays you $20 to $40 for this CO2, and then they make $200, $300 from it. Something wrong with this paradigm and with these economics, and maybe we're not the right people to really change this. And I don't begrudge the oil company for making money. God bless them. That's what business is in business to do. But I think the problem here is that the power industry is set up to take a bath at the expense of a windfall to the oil industry. So, we need to figure out ways that regulated utilities or their non-regulated arms and possibly municipals and co-ops can maybe mimic or re-engineer or even improve upon business models like this. All right, there's a schematic of their process. From my vantage point, again, the innovative thing here is they installed a gas turbine that will supply the process steam. And you could probably brainstorm some improvements on that, I understand. FutureGen is in Illinois. This is the department's signature Oxy-combustion project. I'm asked really frequently, what's going on with FutureGen? Is it going to go forward? Is it not? I've been in the government long enough to know government speak, and I'm going to sort of level with everyone and put it very bluntly. The department is contributing $1 billion towards a $1.8 billion project. So whether FutureGen goes, and the flashpoint for FutureGen is going to be whether and when the Industrial Alliance comes up with $700 million worth of financing. If they can do that, it will go forward. If they cannot, it won't. And that's, that's not unique to this project. Again, we see this over and over with the major demonstrations. Not all of these companies have the deep pockets of a Duke or an Edwardsport or a DOE. Here's the lithology. Now, if you're going to get involved with these technologies, and if this is going to become a business and an industry, I think the power industry is going to need to embrace more chemical engineering than it has historically, and also it's going to need to embrace more geology than it has historically, especially for the storage part. Here we have, they've drilled a well. FutureGen has done the feed. They've done a lot of good things, and I'll stray from my script a little bit. The question was asked, how do you get over public resistance? Well, you look at the original FutureGen project. They turned it into a contest or a competition. And they said, we don't want to take our project somewhere where we're not wanted, so communities come and apply for this project. And we got, 11 proposals from 7 states. We narrowed that down to 4 proposals from 2 states. And then they picked one. And then it got all restructured again. And when it got restructured, it was sent to Illinois. And we got, again, a number of proposals that came in. And I've sat across the table from farmers. I've had homeowners say to me, look, my property borders this plant site, and I have 7 children. Will you help me and tell me what kind of questions I should be asking you in order to protect them? And I've also sat across, there was one discussion at the current site, on the current project, where we were talking to 3 farmers. And they came in and all this public opposition stuff, all these questions they had studied, they were loaded for us. And Ken Humphreys, the CEO of the FutureGen Alliance, was there, and I was in this group. There were 5 of us, Ken, me, 3 farmers. And they're asking all these questions, and finally they said, okay, if you want to acquire this pore space underneath our farms, how much are you willing to pay? And Ken didn't want to give it away because it's sort of a negotiated thing, but he gave away sort of a ballpark figure, $1,000 an acre. I watched those men perform the math in their heads instantaneously. What do you think that adds up to if you have a 100-acre farm or a 1,000-acre farm? There were no more questions. That's one way, those are 2 ways that you can counter public resistance. I mean, you don't want to go somewhere where you're not wanted, right? Because it's going to be problems for you, it's going to be problems for them. Let's just avoid all that. And is everybody going to sign up? No. But the Alliance, Jordan showed that clover leaf. One thing he neglected to say was the Alliance has acquired pore space rights for 10,000 acres. So it can be done. You just need to be creative. All right. This is the one that's operational. It's at an oil refinery, and this is where people in the power industry zone out. It's at a Valero oil refinery on a steam methane reformer that takes natural gas and converts it into hydrogen, and they typically vent the CO2. So now they want to capture the CO2, put it in a Denbury pipeline, and then it'll go into EOR, and they've been doing this for, they started up the one steam methane reformer, they started up the one CO2 capture unit in 2012 and the other in 2013. They've captured over 1 million metric tons so far, and so why should you be interested in what people are doing on an oil refinery? Well, if you're not interested and you don't believe in CCS and you don't want it to happen, then zone me out. But if you think you might get sucked into this, this is the largest CO2 compressor in the United States and quite possibly the world. So they're integrating that with a pipeline. And those aren't simple things. So if you don't look at this, you're going to have to sort of refigure it out yourself. Now, the Kemper compressor is the same basic model as this, and it's kind of like gas turbines. The newer ones crank out a couple more megawatts, so it's going to be just slightly bigger, even though it's going to be processing 3 times the CO2. Here we have a schematic. As you can see, it's on an oil refinery. But again, it's a large, complex integration project that we can all learn lessons from. Archer Daniels Midland, again, a biofuels plant. And Jordan went into this in good detail, so I'll skip through that. But there are some photos. And also, always be careful what you hear about Decatur, because there are 2 different projects, 2 different wells. So be careful not to confuse the 2. And the last one is a Petcoke gasification plant that would produce methanol at Lake Charles, Louisiana. I've already gone through the EOR economics. EOR isn't the answer and the solve-all for everybody, but it makes money. And we think that many of the early adopters are going to use EOR. You know, until you have a carbon price or a regulation that requires you to do this, you're not going to spend the money to do it unless you can recover it. And that's why EOR is so important to do on the early ones, and we'll learn from that. And then when we saturate the oil fields, oh, by the way, you know how much oil we can recover? At that $10 an oil price, there's 80 to 100 billion barrels of oil that can be recovered by this CO2, according to credible studies by Advanced Resources International. So at $10 a barrel of oil, that ridiculously low price, that's a $1 trillion opportunity in the United States alone. At $100 a barrel, that's $10 trillion. So how many CCS systems, as expensive as they are, could you build for a fraction of $1 trillion or a fraction of $10 trillion? How many power plants, how much infrastructure could you replace for a fraction of that? So sure, CCS is expensive, but as my friend Professor Rubin says, if you figure out it's going to cost tens of billions, maybe even hundreds of billions of dollars to do CCS on your fleets. A staggering number. But if you don't do it, you're going to go into renewables. You're going to go into gas and possibly uncertain gas prices 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now. And if you price out those renewables and the other options, and Ed has done this, he runs the economic models, it's not going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars. It's going to cost, the estimates are 1 to 3 trillion. So sure, it's expensive, but the alternative is even more expensive. So there's my contact information. I'm on LinkedIn if you want to look me up, and I don't know if I run over time.
We got time for a couple of questions.
John Lemkiller with Great Lakes Solutions. I'm kind of questioning your assumption around $100 a barrel, because The reason why those wells maybe aren't producing is because the profitability and the cost to operate them doesn't justify even at $100 a barrel to run them sometimes. So now they're spending $20 to $40 for the CO2. I guess what I'm saying is each well is different, each situation is different, but the reason why they leave so much in the ground and go drill another well is because the cost based on the return on the oil hurts them, or the profit margin's just not enough. So it's cheaper to go drill another well than to operate it. So it's just something to maybe throw into how you're doing the analysis there on that. The second question I had is on the timing. And developing technology, I sympathize with you. It's a tough thing to do, and it's not just a product or something. The commercial issues and stuff you're dealing with as well on financing and everything, based on your timelines and the regulation timelines, do you think these projects are going to get to a point where people will look at them as real parts of the state's plans to deal with what they're dealing with CO2?
I'm a technologist, and I also tend to be an optimist. And my first big project was the Bailey scrubber over. I don't know if we have anybody here from NIPSCO, but we funded that. And it was there were people at the time saying, you can't build a scrubber without spares. Yeah, we know it worked in Germany. Yeah, we know it worked in Japan. And so, we built one with no backups or spares modules. Produced wallboard grade gypsum. We have like 8 to 12 different advances that scrubber made, and even though they never sold another one in this country, all the other vendors came and copied those features, and it became, those specs from that project became the standard specs for the power industry. And the vendors who prior to that project would only provide you a 2-year guarantee on your scrubber. Afterwards, they were providing 7 years. So if these projects are successful, yes, they will bring costs down, and people will come and not only copy these, but they will improve upon them. With the oil field economics, I think, the oil company spends money to get more oil out of the ground, but if you understand, I have 2 degrees in geology. I thought I was going to go to work in the oil industry, but they didn't. They were smart enough and didn't want me. You drill a well, and you produce from the pressure in the formation, and you pump it out, but at some point your production declines. So then you go in and you do what is called secondary production, which is typically uses water as the driving fluid, water or steam. And then you have an injection well surrounded by some production wells, and you get more, but at some point that declines. And at that point, you still have a very significant fraction of the oil in the ground, in many cases, half to 2/3. So then you go to tertiary production, which is typically CO2 flooding. And the one place where it's been done a lot, and it's only been done for about the past 40 years, but it has been done for 40 years, primarily in the Permian Basin of West Texas. It's a hot market for CO2. They get their CO2 from natural sources, 800-mile pipeline. And when I visited Kinder Morgan's Sackrock field, which is the largest of the EOR fields, we asked the operator what the market is like for CO2 there, and the manager, and he said, you know what, if our oil field went offline or down for whatever reason, and we came up again next week, I doubt that our CO2 supply would be there. They will have sold it to someone else. So it's a really hot market for oil, and they've been dying in East Texas. And they've been using anthropogenic CO2 in East Texas, so they've been doing it in the Hastings field for the past couple of years, and we're going to do it in another field there. Again, these are people who work in the oil industry at ARI, and a huge potential. I understand there's a cost, but it's not $100 a barrel. And you know what? You don't go in and take the oil out and it's all gone today or tomorrow or 5 years. We're talking about creating an industry that will last for like 50 years. And I've been asked this by graduate students. It's like, well, What's the time frame that you would put this over? Who knows? But pulling a figure out of the air 50 years. Is oil really going to cost $100 a barrel in 30 or 40 years? None of us knows. It could be significantly more than that. Okay, sorry.
Any other questions?
Can you comment a little bit about the disclosure requirements for some of these companies that are receiving these hundreds of millions of dollars grants? So, you know, to what extent is the information publicly available to everyone in this room versus what's kept proprietary?
Okay, a lot of the funding, all of the projects except one are receiving funding under the Recovery Act. So there were some transparency requirements. There, you know, a lot of spending and financial data are on the Recovery Act websites. You know, we saluted, we did everything we had to do for that. So probably more information than a lot. But, you know, in terms of technical data, you know, come on, Siemens has been developing their IGCC technology for over 20 years. They're not going to, you know, they're not going to divulge the proprietary portions of their technology that they've invested in for the past 20 years just because they're receiving a fraction of the funding on this. Another thing to think of in these demos, and we kind of ran into it with the Pure Air project. The Pure Air project got in the crosshairs between General Electric and Mitsubishi. We went in there, and you know, General Electric and a number of other American companies were all upset that we were funding a Japanese technology, and it became a political brouhaha that Mitsubishi was making money that they thought, who knows what they thought. But you know, so you go in and you look at the cost of the scrubber, and you look at, you know, it was a $90 million scrubber. And you look, so you go down and you figure out what their technology fee is. I don't know what it is, but it's not much, it's not $90 million, not even $10 million, or even $5 million. And then you figure, okay, this scrubber costs like 40% less than the alternative. And who is that going into the power company's pockets? No, that's a lower compliance cost that the ratepayers would have to pay. So you figure what the ratepayers are going to save over the 30-year lifetime of a project, and it dwarfs this, you know, perceived windfall that these companies are getting. The ratepayers are the primary beneficiary of this, not any particular company, at least in my mindset. And we can argue that over a beer. Great, thank you.
Thank